So one of the first things that you're going to ask yourself when you get into shooting with film, or in photography in general actually, is what kind of camera can I use? And the important thing is it actually doesn't really matter what kind of camera you have. It does matter if you got it from your parents, passed on by your grandparents or so, or you got it in the secondhand store. The important thing is that you have a camera with manual settings that you can adjust. And these settings are the shutter speed, the ISO speed, and the aperture. Now, let me start by talking about the shutter speed. The shutter speed determines the amount of time that your film is being exposed. So if I have a very fast shutter speed, like so, my film is only being exposed for a very short amount of time. And the opposite, if I have a very slow shutter speed, you can see that if there was film in here now, I mean, obviously it would be ruined because there's no lens and everything, but my film would be exposed for a much longer period of time. Now, I'll give you a few examples of what that could look like. Right here, I'm standing in like a tube metro station and I'm having a longer shutter speed, and that's also what kind of created this effect of these light trails. And obviously the image isn't very sharp, it's kind of wobbly because I wasn't using a tripod, and that's, for example, an effect of having a longer shutter speed. Of course, this plays together with what kind of aperture you have, and that's the next thing I'm going to get into. Now, the aperture it can be split down into like two components really, and the first thing is the aperture is controlled by these blades inside of the lens, and as you can see that as I'm turning this wheel, the blades are opening and closing. Now, as the blades are on the widest position, naturally the most light comes in. And if I close them, then less light comes in. So this is very straightforward. But it has another effect, and I'm going to explain this by showing you this picture right here. Like, as you can see, the guitarist is quite in focus, and the people that are standing around aren't really in focus. So I shot this at the maximum aperture, the widest possible, so the opening was very wide, and that gave me something called a very shallow depth of field. And this is something you play around with. Obviously, the opposite would be like in this picture where the aperture was very, very small. Everything's in focus. You can see all the people in the background, on the streets, and you can't really tell if there would be an area that's completely out of focus. So this is really one of the settings that you play around with again. And the important thing about film photography is because these are the two settings, the aperture and the shutter speed are the settings that you work with as you shoot. Those you constantly adjust. It's very rare that you always shoot at exactly the same speeds. If you're like in a street environment, or you're using your camera on different days and whatever. So these are the things that you constantly adjust. And then there's something that you don't constantly adjust. In fact, you only adjust it once, and that's when you put your film into the camera. Now, some cameras have light meters, some cameras don't. If your camera has a light meter, your light meter is going to tell you approximately what your correct exposure would be. So if you're shooting through here, I mean, every system is different, but in mine, for example, there are two lines that move along, and when they're perfectly aligned above each other, I have a correct exposure. Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's not. It really depends on what you do, but that's something you got to play around with. Anyway, so the ISO speed it tells your camera what kind of light situation you're in and what kind of sensitivity your film has. So every film has a specific ISO sensitivity. So like this one right here, I mean, this is a very old roll. This is expired. It's no good. So I'm going to be using this for test purposes. This is an old roll of Kodak Porta, and it's 160 ISO. Now, the film speed right here determines what kind of sensitivity your film will have and what kind of grain. If the number is very high, if it's something like 800, there'll be more grain. If it's lower, there'll be less grain, so the image in total will be sharper. The problem is, though, as the number is smaller, so you have a very high sensitivity, you'll need more light on the film to expose it. So that means that if you're shooting with something like ISO 100 in the evening, you're probably going to get completely underexposed shots, unless you're sitting on a tripod and you got your shutter speed at a very low number, so a lot of light can come in. But if you're shooting out of your hand, you're probably going to get all wobbly pictures. So you got to watch out for that. Now, when you load your camera with film, you got to put in when you put in your film, you got to match your film's ISO speed with the camera's ISO speed. This is very important, because if you're shooting on a film and it's ISO 160 like this one, and I would tell my camera that I'm shooting ISO 800, then I'd be giving my light meter the wrong readings, and my pictures would probably go out either underexposed or overexposed. So this is something you just got to watch out for. And then this is a setting you only do once, so it's nothing you set it once and you forget about it and you don't worry about it anymore, really. So yeah, and then finally I'm gonna just show you how I would load this camera. I mean, every camera has kind of like a different system, but most of these are very similar. So maybe there's another tutorial on the internet for specifically your model, but this is a Leica Flex SL, and basically the way it works is I got my lever right here, and this is how the camera opens. So what do is I have my film, and I just put it in here, and then I got to advance it manually. I got to pull it out with my hand, and over here you have these kind of sprockets right here, and this is where I got to put my film. So I'm going to just hold down here so it doesn't pop out, and put it right in here into the sprocket so it sits tight. So it's in here now. But I gotta advance my film naturally. So I pull forward and I expose it. So now it sits tight. I can close it, close my camera, close this. And you see I have my shutter counter right here, and it's just before 0. So I gotta advance a few times. And now my film has moved forward, because before there was this area which was ruined, and the rest of the film was inside the case. So now it's moved forward, and I'm basically ready to shoot. Then another thing you obviously got to watch out for, like as you're shooting, you're never allowed to open this the case right here, because obviously I'm doing this now because the film is ruined, so it's just for demonstration. But if I did this, all of this would be ruined again. So please don't open your camera until you've finished shooting. And then once you've finished shooting, of course, like I'm just going to imagine that I'm at the end of my film. The way it works on this camera is you got to rewind the film. So there's a button right here that I press, and then there's the rewinder, and I just rewind all the way to the end. And you can see right now there's resistance right here. So as I rewind, I keep going until the resistance stops. And then when I see that it stops, like it's very loose now, I can safely assume that my film is in here, and it is, and I don't have to worry about ruining my film. So it's out, boom, right now, and I can take my film to the lab and it can be developed, or I can develop it myself. So this has been a small introduction into film photography in general. If you have any more questions, please hit me up on my YouTube channel. You can leave a comment, you can leave some feedback, that would be highly appreciated. Check out my Instagram, Do You Develop, and thank you for your time, thank you for watching, and this was my first video, so I hope I was good enough to please all of you, and let me know if there's anything you'd like to see in the future. Take care.